Hey, let's get away to a beautiful location for a destination retreat that will transform your relationship. This opportunity is unlike anything you've done before. 2 days with Brad will give your relationship the boost it needs. Then enjoy the beautiful scenery. Go to healingbrokentrust.com for more information. Do it soon because time is limited.
Early this year, my wife disclosed multiple infidelities, often one-night stand type incidents. A year and a half ago, she visited and spent the night at the house of my best friend, a mutual close friend who is married. My wife, best friend, and his wife began drinking alcohol and to flirt their way toward a threesome. During time alone with my wife, my friend asked her to go to the bedroom for sex, to which she consented. My wife described that she was aware that she agreed to have sex with my friend and that she knew it was wrong despite being inebriated. She doesn't deny their intent. Nevertheless, she described that she became less conscious by the minute and that she remembers reaching the bed, but nothing else. The next morning, she woke up in bed with my friend and asked him if they had had sex. He replied, yeah, like 6 or 7 times. Even though she initially consented to sex, she was unable to consent to anything else that happened once they reached the bedroom, much less sex 6 or 7 times. My question is how to discuss the betrayals that night leading up to the minutes before the sexual assault, but also how to be compassionate about the unwarranted violations she experienced at the hands of someone we both trusted completely. The infidelity is compounded not only from the betrayal by my wife, but the betrayals by my friend from sleeping with my wife and then progressing to sexually assaulting the person I cherish most in this world, who I was unable to protect. You have my permission to use my voice.
Man, his story is so sad. It's really hard to hear that. That's a lot of pain that he's experienced.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tragedy. I hate hearing stuff like that. I've had numerous clients in similar situations, and it's tricky, Morgan, because there's a lot of wounds and trauma created from that, where both people are suffering. And it's not impossible to heal, but it's definitely very painful for both people. And so it's a very traumatizing situation. One of the things that we've talked about before, and this is a clear situation where you see that clearly in both people, and that is affair recovery is trauma recovery. One of the goals of affair recovery is to work through the trauma that's there. And this gentleman's been severely traumatized, not just by his wife consenting, but by his friend taking advantage of his wife, and then her being traumatized in that manner. It's really horrible to hear about that. So one of the things, is affair recovery is trauma recovery, as well as working on the marriage, as well as working towards post-traumatic growth and making this a greater thing, getting good out of a horrible situation. It's a terrible thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's hard because he needs healing and so does she, and to be reassuring and to care for his hurting wife while needing reassurance back. It's just such a hard place to be. But so let's talk about where to start. Okay. When you've worked with couples in similar situations, some make it and some don't. But can we talk about what those successful couples do? One thing some couples and individuals do is they go to trauma therapy. So when should they do trauma therapy?
Yeah, Morgan, not every individual who's been betrayed needs to go see a trauma therapist, but a lot do. A ton of them do. And the reason for that is, I've talked about this before, maybe not on the podcast, but I've talked about it before with you. A couple's marriage is going to get better before the individual is going to get better who's betrayed. A marriage is going to get stronger. A relationship's going to get stronger. I can help a couple walk through the healing process in honestly fairly short time, but when PTSD symptoms are lingering and there's this deep emotional wound there and people are still experiencing flashbacks and triggers and startled and different things like that, it's really a wise idea to see a trauma therapist, somebody who specializes in trauma recovery, who uses methods like EMDR. The reason for that is your marriage is going to get better and you can be truly happily married and your marriage can really be transformed. But who wants to still have flashbacks? Who still wants to get triggered? And who wants to go to a movie and then, have like something pop out at you and the whole movie's spoiled. Everybody wants to be able to turn on the radio and just listen to whatever's playing and not get triggered, and not go to this place inside. And so sometimes with infidelity, what often happens is people die inside. That part of us dies, and we can reconnect to our spouse and have them be a healer for us and be with us. But when you are experiencing, significant, and I need to list some of these symptoms, but when you're still experiencing severe hypervigilance, severe anxiety, flashbacks, when you're really dealing with those trauma symptoms and self-image issues and depression, when you're dealing with things like that, you really need to go see a trauma therapist. Part of it is it can help the marriage in one sense, and I want to get to that in a minute, but really what it does is it's a quality of life issue. It helps us enjoy our life more. We don't have to walk around as dead people and feel this pain inside of us and feel these insecurities from this. We can feel good again and maybe even feel better than we did before again. And so that's why I talk with people about that. I don't tell everybody they need to go do it, but sometimes when there's a lot of pain and trauma, we need to do it. One of the things that trauma does, Morgan, when it's really intense, and you see this more in the beginning, but sometimes after repeated betrayals, sometimes after walking in on them, having the affair, sometimes when you've seen a lot of really the nasty details and you maybe even seen it physically, when that pain is really intense, it keeps us from being able to feel the need or the want that we have for our partner. And so, we may not be taking actions to divorce, but we may not be sending any clear signals to our spouse that we still want them or need them. In fact, we may be stuck in a negative cycle of blaming and criticizing and getting stuck on the details of the affair. We've been really hurt and traumatized. And so what EMDR can do and trauma treatments can do is lower that pain where we're beginning to heal. Because when we're hurting, when we're stuck in that hurt, you never want to go do it again. You never want to go through that with your spouse. Nobody wants to go do it again, period. But when you don't really want to let yourself need them again or want them again. And allowing yourself to need your spouse after they betrayed you is something that you have to have happen in order to really heal together, if that's your goal. And so EMDR, I've had some people who've been so hurt that I was kind of wondering are they detached? Is this a wound that's too big to heal? Can we get there? And EMDR has helped them be able to heal those wounds and has helped them be able to really get back to being normal again so that they can communicate that they want their spouse again. Because when we're hurting, we kind of put our arm up, our guard up, and keep our spouse away. But on the inside, we really need them and we want them, but that never gets communicated.
Okay, so what you're saying, dear, it sounds like that when people are massively traumatized or have any sort of trauma that's significant to them, it's really hard to open up and be vulnerable and let their spouse in, even though they really want to deep inside, because we all need that connection. It's just really difficult because the trauma is standing between the two of them. It's sort of blocking them from being able to connect with their spouse the way they want to. Is that right?
Yeah, Morgan, you said it perfectly. I've had people where they have been severely traumatized through repeated betrayals or nasty ways of discovering an affair where they were very traumatized, but they kept coming back to therapy, kept trying to work on the marriage, but really never said, I want you in my life, or I'm trying to make this work because I love you. They never could say anything that vulnerable. Once the pain was dealt with, then they were able to start being more vulnerable and more open about just how significant their spouse is in their life. And so there's a lot of pain, a lot of hurt. We don't get that. In fact, we get, how could you do this? Why did you do this? We get the angry side, the side that pushes us away, the guarded side of them, not the vulnerable side. Because it's just too risky when there's a lot of pain to show the vulnerable side.
Right.
Morgan, something else I wanted to mention is that the more pain there is, sometimes the more somebody's been traumatized, the more hurts they've experienced from the affair or just in life, the more trauma they've experienced, really understanding the why. Why did you do this? How could this have happened? and them not just understanding it, but believing it, and them understanding the rationale. It's going to be harder when there's been more trauma that person has experienced. If they've experienced more trauma from the person who betrayed them, it's going to be hard. And it's also going to be hard if they experienced more trauma from family members or an ex. When we're traumatized, we tend to see the world as more black and white because it's safer. But to really understand why an affair happened, you have to see it as more gray. Because you go on these forums and you go online and you read about people who've been betrayed when they're talking to each other. A lot of it is, this person who betrayed me is, of the devil. They're evil. And maybe
there's not an ounce of good in them at all.
Yeah, maybe there's not an ounce of good. And, honestly, some of them may be that way. If I'm being honest, there may be a handful of them that are truly that way, but that's not been my experience. My experience has been maybe a handful of them have really been that kind of person.
So they're really that black and white because they've been so traumatized. It's hard to see any ounce of good in the person who hurt them so badly.
Absolutely. Well, it's kind of like, nature gave us that so that when our ancestors got ate by lions or trampled on by the buffalo, we would see that as dangers and want to keep our distance or want to ensure our survival and our children's survival. So we would, let's go attack, let's go kill. It imprints that in our brain. So we have a real black and white thought process on it. But to really heal, you kind of have to have a more nuanced gray perspective on it. You have to see, you have to see the gray in it.
You have to embrace the in-between, the both ands, which are very hard. It's very hard to do when you're hurting.
The more pain there is, the more black and white we tend to see our partner's rationale and the less sense it'll make to us. And, maybe they don't know, so that's not helping us if they can't explain and they don't know their own feelings. And that's where you need a really good marriage counselor. It's where you need an expert to help you through issues like that. Because a lot of people who stray aren't in touch with their own emotions. That's part of why they strayed. They're not able to tell you, I got my feelings hurt. I'm not able to tell you, I felt hurt by this. And so that's why they stray. And so EMDR, back to that, EMDR can be a really good, and there's other trauma treatments, but I really like EMDR because EMDR is a very effective way. It's also a common way. You're much more likely to find a good trauma therapist than you are a good marriage counselor. Believe it or not, you can find a trauma therapist who uses EMDR much easier than you're probably going to find a good marriage counselor. One of the last things I want to say about this is that when there's trauma or intense pain, it tends to keep us locked in our negative cycle. So when somebody has a lot of pain and a lot of hurt, they are going to be more like a couple that's more likely to get stuck in their negative cycle and really have an escalated negative cycle. Not just get stuck in a rut, but be more likely to get caught in conflict and to really have a nasty negative cycle. And so EMDR can help take the edge off of that. And then just the last thing I would say about EMDR is that, like I mentioned earlier, it just improves the quality of our life. You can have a marriage that's perfectly healed and, where you're genuinely happy with each other. But when there's a trauma there, you get triggered, you get flashbacks. It's just harder to enjoy your life. The insecurities plague you. EMDR is a method that works very fast to help you work through that. And so it's worth finding an EMDR therapist. Morgan, you have had an experience with EMDR. Do you want to tell our listeners about that?
Sure. Actually, as you know, I've experienced 3 different therapies for trauma therapy. As a client, personally, one of them I can't recall the name, but one of them was thought-filled therapy, and the other is this EMDR that you're talking about. And I think it would be really valuable just to share some insight as far as what it's like and what to expect. So I went to thought-filled therapy for several months, and this particular model uses pressure points like acupuncture. So it's not technically acupuncture. It's not what they do in the session, but it's using those acupuncture points in the body to sort of reprogram the way we think about the trauma. And I didn't really have to talk in great detail about the issues I experienced, but I found talking about some of the issues or talking some about it helped so that the therapist could kind of know where to start tapping. And tapping is the term that they use because they'll tap we'll tap our fingers on the acupuncture points in the body. And so it's kind of a slang term you might hear around thought field therapy, or TFT is tapping. So the therapist would ask me about the thing that concerned me the most, and we'd put a pain scale, so from 1 to 10, where the pain was whenever I was thinking about it. And then the goal would be to tap it down, tap the pain down. So I might start it as an 8, and then as we processed it and tapped on it, it would come down to a 5. So, or, lower. And we would keep working on it and kind of processing it through. Then, as I felt the pain, she would have me follow her in this tapping sort of algorithm, I guess. And you had mentioned that even after using thought field therapy, I seemed like a totally different person. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I thought it helped you. And it was just stuff kind of more from your past, before us, that you were kind of working on. But yeah, I thought it helped a lot.
Oh, yeah. And so part of it would be we'd tap on the eyebrow and then the chin and collarbone, and and we'd hum like in a chord and then count 1, 2, 3. But the point of it is that there was some relief there. It wasn't bad. But then I found EMDR and for similar issues, and what I'm finding is that the healing seems to be happening quicker and more clearly than it did with thought field therapy. And one of the reasons I think that is because with tapping, I had to, we would close our eyes and I'd kind of think about the issue, but then I would have to open my eyes and then sort of I'd have to continue thinking about that issue, but then I'd have to follow these instructions, these complex instructions. And so with EMDR, I talked as much or as little as I wanted about the issues with EMDR, just enough for the therapist to understand where to start, very much like thought field therapy. But it was like you'd hold these little vibrating paddles in your hand, and it would vibrate back and forth, back and forth. So what was nice about that is that I didn't have to stop and then try to go follow some complex instructions and then come back to it. It was clearing the memory as I was, I guess, experiencing the memory. And so it seemed much simpler for me to work through it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Morgan, it makes sense. And Morgan, something you've said about EMDR before is that EMDR is a very quick way to heal trauma and pain, in that there are several studies showing the effectiveness of EMDR and its application to several different types of situations. Combat veterans, you name it, EMDR has been applied to it, and it is some of the best for healing trauma. And it's a weird, unique way to deal with trauma that can help people work through issues very quickly without taking months and months and months of time, because it incorporates some talk therapy, but it's mainly about applying this procedure that helps people just quickly, work through the pain that's there and resolve that pain very fast, very quickly. And so one of the things I just wanted to just mention before we go is kind of where the future of psychology is heading, and the profession of therapy, mental therapy is going. Right now they are doing clinical studies with a drug called MDMA, which some of you guys know as the part of the drug ecstasy, which helps eliminate fear. It quiets the part of our brain that triggers our fear and our fight or flight response, the amygdala. And what they're finding is that people who have really been severely traumatized and nothing else has even helped them at all, like things like EMDR haven't even helped them. And I'm saying EMDR is this great method, but people who've been really severely traumatized, nothing's been able to help them, because to heal trauma, you have to be able to at least talk about it or at least think about it. And sometimes when people have been severely traumatized, like, for example, cases of sexual abuse, especially incest, things like that, it's extremely hard to go back and remember that, to work on it. And so people really stay in a state where they continue to suffer from PTSD.
Very hypervigilant, it's so difficult for them to even step close to it, that something like thought field therapy or EMDR may not even be helpful to them. So it kind of depends on the person. And that's also why I describe thought field therapy. For some people, that might be the thing that really unlocks their trauma and helps them. For me, I felt like EMDR was just a better process because I didn't have to do as much work. It felt like I didn't have to put forth as much effort with EMDR as I did with thought field therapy. So it seems for me to be a faster process. But for someone else, it may be a completely different experience. So that's why it's important to kind of know what's available. And you might try a few things, but at least you have the knowledge of what's available to you. And hopefully this, what is it, EMDA or what's it called?
MDMA.
MDMA will really transform some lives, because that's huge.
The only way you can get it is through clinical studies. There's some in Boulder, there's some in military studies. MAPS, I think .org it's a place in Boulder where they're doing a clinical study right now. And what MDMA is allowing people to do is it's taking the fear out of facing the trauma. They're giving people this compound, and they're doing 8-hour therapy sessions with people, and people are feeling great when they're doing therapy. They're in a great mood, they're relaxed, they don't have any of the anxiety, and then they're able to do like a normal trauma type of treatment on it. And they're finding that people who have had severe lifelong post-traumatic stress disorder are working through it very, very quickly. And so that's something that's exciting for me, to think about the number of people who are going to be getting help with that. And if you're in areas where they're doing a study, it's worth checking out. It's worth doing your own research, of course, because you're ultimately responsible for your own well-being. It's worth also Googling and just kind of reading about this. It's really fascinating. I've read a lot about it. One quick thing, too, I'll just mention this on a side note. They're also having similar results with a plant, and I'm going to mispronounce it, so I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. But there's a plant-based compound that people are taking, and they're using this in Mexico. It's not illegal in Mexico, but they're using it in Mexico for people who are severely addicted to alcohol, and they are severely addicted to other types of drugs. And they're taking this plant, and they're finding them working through this addiction very quickly, where the brain is rewiring and healing itself, where they're no longer wanting the actual substance anymore. And Psychology Today magazine a couple months ago had an article about how this new plant is helping people, and applying it in a therapy setting for addictions, is helping people work through some of the worst of the worst of the worst, who have done everything imaginable to try to break alcoholism and haven't been successful. And I read this a little bit ago, so I may misquote some of this, but about 70% of the people who were the worst of the worst of the worst, who nothing else helped, they took this substance, and then it helped them heal the emotional wounds and baggage that were making them addicts. And the example they gave of this guy whose marriage was falling apart because of his alcoholism, he signed up for the study, and he took it, and there's 2 therapists in the room with him to provide safety. And he took it, and he wept for 6 hours on their couch. And as he was weeping, though, he was going inward, and all this emotional baggage that he had during his life and from his childhood and from other circumstances was getting healed from just taking a plant. I don't know how much work the therapists were doing. That article didn't seem to imply that they did much. Obviously, they created safety, and I'm sure they did some stuff. I just don't remember at the moment. But this guy, he wasn't addicted to alcohol anymore. It was just a one-time experience. And so, there's some really exciting things as far as healing trauma goes. We all know how, veterans of wars of combat experience have a hard time with PTSD. There's some really exciting things coming for them as well. for all people who suffer from PTSD. This gentleman, just kind of a little last part of the story, the gentleman that they talked about in this article in Psychology Today, who took this, he was able to still drink some. He wasn't like addicted to it, but he was still able to drink and not be addicted to the alcohol. So he'd drink kind of socially. That he was able to be a social drinker and not like a regular drinker again. And so it's really fascinating because those emotional wounds were healed just from what God put on this earth. If God is all loving, I think he would put something on our earth to help us, better our condition, help ourselves. And that's what it seems like he's done. And we just have to apply that in an appropriate, responsible manner.
Absolutely. So to kind of bring it back to this man's question, this scenario that we presented at the beginning of the show, the reason we talk so heavily about trauma is because so clearly you and there are many other people who are listening to this, and many couples that we've seen, and we've helped thousands of couples all over the world, and we've seen people in very similar situations. It's definitely a trauma. It's a trauma that is very difficult. And so you can do couples therapy and you can make some serious strides and you can have the loving relationship that you deserve and that you want. But those traumas still trigger. They're still triggered by environment and things like that. And so issues that come up. And so these trauma therapies can be extremely helpful and very useful for many of you who are listening to just help you enjoy your relationship as you heal it. Mm-hmm. So with that, is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish?
Yeah, I think, the gentleman asking the question and his wife, as they work through this situation, you're going to want to find somebody who really is an expert in helping you heal. This is not an impossible situation. It's obviously very hurtful. Things like EMDR can help both of you guys heal together, because the ultimate goal of this, like we've talked about before, is post-traumatic growth. But really it's about healing in each other's arms. It's being there for each other, healing in each other's arms. And sometimes it's really hard to do when we're in a lot of pain, because we're guarded. We're giving them the stiff arm. And when there's a lot of pain, we tend to do that with each other. Even though we want them there, we tend to do things that push each other away. And so it's not an impossible situation. I've helped couples like that. It's a very sad situation because you hate to hear about people getting taken advantage of. It's such a terrible, terrible situation. It's just sad. I've had that happen, more than I can count. I'm trying to think right now as we talk about it. I've had it happen a lot. One of the hardest parts of it, Morgan, we haven't mentioned this before, but one of the hardest, we did in the 10 Types of Affairs episode, we talked about the sexual abuse affair where somebody gets abused. And one of the tricky things with that type of an affair is, and I don't know if this is what's happened in, the person asking the question, but it happens a lot. And this is just a good reminder, is sometimes when somebody gets abused, because we get afraid, sometimes they're not always believed by their spouse that it was abuse. Maybe they did kind of cross over into some gray areas, but what can be really challenging is, when we're not believed by our spouse, and that tends to make it worse. But these are complicated subjects. This is a hard, difficult thing. You guys can do it. Just getting the right help. You'd be surprised at what you can do with the right help. And Morgan, that's why we make ourselves available to you guys who listen. That's why we have retreats. This past week, I had couple different retreats in our office. I had a blast working with these couples. We were able to work through literally everything that we needed to work through. I've already heard from one of them saying how fantastic they're still doing, how great they're feeling. And so I would expect, really honest, and I mean this sincerely, I think anybody can work through this. A lot of it's about having the right map, the right tools, the right support, and really getting the right help. Because you don't want somebody working on your marriage who's a novice, who's just beginning. You don't want to have to learn off of somebody. And that's what often happens in a lot of therapy. I could talk about this for hours. The way therapy is done and the way therapists are trained, a lot of it is unfortunately designed where the public is the guinea pig as the therapist is learning and developing. And so there's not really a lot of really good processes to help people get to where they need to be as competent and great marriage counselors. And you wouldn't tolerate that for somebody doing heart surgery on you.
Absolutely not.
Or a brain surgeon going in, if they cut you open and they hit the wrong spot on your brain.
Yeah.
Are you gonna go numb on the left side of your body? Are you gonna go paralyzed? Are you gonna no longer develop new memories? But the same thing happens with people going to marriage counseling, couples counseling. They'll go to somebody who advertises they do it, but never do any research. And part of that's, you should be able to trust when somebody says they do marriage counseling. You should trust that you're in good hands. But the problem is that 70% of people in private practice say they do marriage counseling, but only about 14, maybe 17% actually have any advanced training in marriage counseling. Not even that full 14% who have the advanced training in marriage counseling are using the latest methods. It's a lot lower than 14%. It's probably closer to 3 or 5%. It's really terrible. So anyway, That's my little rant.
And those are people that have the degrees. They have the master's, the doctorate. That's who we're talking about. We're not talking about lay therapists or coaches, and we're talking about people who have a degree, but they just don't have the training.
Yeah. And Morgan, the other part of it is you really want to go, and, a lot of therapists just don't specialize. When
truly specialize.
They don't truly specialize. They'll say, my specialty is in working with children, but I see kids, eating disorders. I see anything that walks through the door, basically. But I really enjoy working with, this population. But I do everything is what they do. And we're one of the only places in the country that just does marriage counseling. I don't have any interest in individual issues. Sure, some of it's fascinating. I don't treat individuals. I don't have that kind of interest in it.
Right, because if you were to try to do that, then how would
less effective in what I'm doing now?
Yeah, you'd be less effective in what you're doing now, and it's like I was thinking as you were saying about like the brain surgeon or the heart surgeon, they have cadavers to work on. We don't have dead people who will tell us their problems. Dead men don't talk, right?
Yeah, dead men tell no tales.
That's right.
And so, part of this is you got to get great help with these situations because they're harder. It's hard when you got a negative cycle before an affair, but it's a lot harder when you got a negative cycle after an affair, and you're not sure if you want to keep giving and trying to make it work, and definitely when your spouse isn't sure they want to make it work. And so, you've got to get expert help, and you can't just take it for granted that everybody that you're going to go to or talk to or look into for marriage counseling really knows what they're doing. And so that's why we're here. We want to be a resource for you guys. That's why we created this podcast, to share this information freely. And so you've got to really, just be careful. But go to somebody who just does marriage counseling. And if you don't have anybody in your area, come to us, travel to us, or we'll meet you in a destination retreat in a fun place. But you've got to be aware of that. And so didn't really plan on going in that direction, but that's a little soapbox for me because I'm passionate about it. My parents divorced, and if they had good help, I wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be sitting here having a podcast talking about this. So for you guys listening, you guys are really fortunate. In the grand scheme of things, it's kind of maybe God's plan, but it's nothing I would have chosen for myself.
Yeah, you went through a lot of pain as a young person just because of that. It was...
And it could have been prevented with just getting the right help. And so it's preventable for you guys to get the right help.
Not a time to skimp. Definitely a time to pull out all stops. But as I'm listening to his voice in that recording, I do hear a man who really has compassion for his wife. Yeah. And it sounds like he really believes her and that he really cares for her and that he really loves her. And it's very touching because when someone who's so deeply hurt can turn and be so empathetic and so caring towards the one who hurt them, that shows so much strength. My heart just goes out to them. Yeah.
You sense the love, and you're right, Morgan. And let me say this, because I was just mentioning that earlier, not necessarily because it's happening in this situation, but just as maybe more of a learning, for listening. That can kind of be a common scenario, but there is a lot of compassion there and a lot of love, and they're going to work through it. And they're going to make it. That's a foundational ingredient, and that gentleman has it. And you can tell.
You can tell it's in his voice. So you're starting off in a good place, although what you've experienced, no one should have to experience. But we thank you for submitting that question. If you are listening and you have a question that you would like to hear us answer, you can go to healingbrokentrust.com. I have made it on the front page. I've made it available. You'll see a spot for you to record your voice. It will be emailed to us. If you can follow the instructions there and just give us permission to use your voice, that would be great. If not, then your question would be very helpful. We don't have to use it on the air. You just let us know and we won't. So with that, we thank you for listening. Thank you for making us the #1 podcast for healing broken trust, for affair recovery. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you, guys.
Well, have you booked your retreat yet? Make sure to go to healingbrokentrust.com for more information and call 918-281-6060 to book your retreat today. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Healing Broken Trust podcast. As always, this information is for education and entertainment purposes only.